Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts. If you still trust your government to steer the economy, you're in for one wild ride. Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond President Tom Barkin recently queried the economic crystal ball in a speech filled with cautious optimism, mixed metaphors, and a clear message: we are in the middle of a climate of uncertainty, and inflation could stick around like your least favorite relative. Now, while Barkin and his fellow central bankers repeat the mantra of steady as she goes in their inflation fight, a closer look behind the curtain reveals a multitude of structural problems, and a government whose own policies can sometimes feel like a slapstick comedy of errors. Barkin's message is deceptively straightforward: remain modestly restrictive until we're sure inflation's back towards our 2% target. It might sound almost like a Zen koan, balancing on a razor's edge between caution and paralysis. But what does this philosophy hide? Underneath the veneer of steady as she goes lies the grim arithmetic of history. The U.S. has been pummeled by an ever-growing federal deficit, alarming demographic trends, and unpredictable migration flows that are forcing the government's hand. The Fed's recalibration is hardly an exercise in monetary fun, it's an admission that inflation's ghost isn't ready to be exorcised. Consider the numbers. While Bloomberg's survey of economists expects that January's inflation, the Fed's preferred measure, may have cooled slightly, it still stubbornly hovers above that elusive 2% mark. How's that for progress? Not much, if you ask anyone who's been hit with rising living costs. Inflation remains a ticking time bomb, partly because the policies crafted in Washington have, time and again, refused to cut through red tape and tackle root causes head-on. Instead, they've opted for patchwork solutions that have allowed the federal deficit to balloon to historically high levels. In 2024 alone, fiscal irresponsibility continues to be the elephant in the room. The U.S. federal deficit is estimated to have grown beyond $3 trillion, a figure that dwarfs even the most robust economic forecasts. Now, if you haven't noticed, there's another monster under the Fed's bed: policy uncertainty from Washington. Barkin famously remarked that it is difficult to make significant changes to monetary policy when government moves in Washington are as unpredictable as a game of economic roulette. And what is Washington doing these days? The Trump administration, fresh off taking office last month, has embarked on a series of moves that throw a wrench into even the most crystal-clear economic models. Immigration crackdowns, downsizing the federal workforce, and a barrage of tariffs against China, and possibly soon against other trading partners, have sent ripples, or should we say shockwaves, across the global financial landscape. Let's put it this way: when policies are unpredictable, investors, consumers, and the Fed are all left performing an economic tango blindfolded. Recent examples from countries such as Argentina and Turkey demonstrate that such policy uncertainty can quickly exacerbate inflation. And here we are, America, arguably the world's economic beacon, performing our own version of a trust fall with Washington's economic policies. Even Chair Jerome Powell has admitted that there simply aren't enough details to confidently gauge how Trump's policies might shift the interest rate needle further. Meanwhile, our hard-working citizens are left wondering if their wages will ever catch up with a cost of living that keeps rising faster than a runaway freight train. Let's not ignore one of the more theatrically absurd elements of this drama: the use of tariffs as a political tool. History has taught us that tariffs can be a double-edged sword. Sure, they can protect domestic industries for a while, but more often than not, they end up translating into higher consumer prices and supply chain disruptions. Take the 2018 trade war with China, for instance. While intended to secure American jobs, it ended up causing significant price hikes in consumer goods, a fact now echoed in the critics' chorus as these policies return with a vengeance. The new wave of tariffs sounding under the Trump administration's drumbeat only further muddy the waters. Barkin himself noted the uncertain legacy of tariffs, having seen how our recent inflationary battles might either dampen or exaggerate the impact of these measures. Perhaps we're on the brink of a new economic quixotic delusion, where defending domestic industry comes at the cost of imperiling domestic financial stability. Similarly, the immigration crackdown represents a short-sighted, yet symbolically charged, Sicilian vendetta against foreign elements. Migration has long been an engine for growth in American manufacturing, technology, and services. By imposing stricter immigration policies, the government risks depriving the economy of the dynamic, often entrepreneurial spirit that fuels innovation and competitiveness. This is not just ideological posturing, but a calculated risk with real economic consequences. A 5% decline in labor force growth, as suggested by recent studies, could shrink the country's GDP potential significantly over the next decade. And yet, policies seem determined to favor political theater over economic pragmatism. Let's throw some more cold, hard numbers on the table. Experts from the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Bureau of Labor Statistics have observed that the U.S. economy is in a precarious state, with core inflation, adjusted for food and energy, still rising at an annual rate of about 2.5% to 3% in many major cities. Wage growth, while seemingly robust in some regions, is being offset by soaring childcare, healthcare, and housing costs. In cities like San Francisco and New York, median rent has increased by 15–20% over the past 2 years, a situation that reflects not just market dynamics but systematic policy failures to address housing affordability. These trends suggest that even if core inflation teeters around the 2% target in macroeconomic reports, the everyday American is experiencing a far steeper picture of rising costs and diminishing purchasing power. Barkin's emphasis on waiting and seeing might ring true for the cautious textbook economist, but for the average voter whose paycheck is stretched thin, it smacks of bureaucratic inefficiency and political inaction. Too many in government seem content to shift blame and delay decisive action while the economic headwinds grow fiercer. Consider the historical role of fiscal irresponsibility. A persistent federal deficit not only erodes confidence in the national currency but puts upward pressure on interest rates. For instance, evidence from the 1970s and 1980s has shown that excessive deficits can eventually trigger a vicious cycle of borrowing costs that stifle economic growth. Fast forward to today, the U.S. deficit is not a relic of past decades but an ominous specter that looms over every policy decision. Now, one might argue that the Fed's cautious approach is prudent, a necessary hedge against the damning externalities of political decisions beyond its control. And to a degree, the Fed is fighting a battle on two fronts, the domestic labor market and the unpredictable maneuvers in Washington. Recent labor market data does paint a picture of resilience. Unemployment rates remain near historic lows, and wage adjustments are, on the surface, keeping pace with inflation in certain sectors. However, let's not be fooled by the solid labor market narrative. A closer examination reveals that this apparent strength is built on uneven foundations. Many industries continue to face a shortage of skilled workers, and the rapid automation in sectors such as manufacturing and services could soon lead to significant structural shifts. Meanwhile, demographic trends, such as an aging population and declining birth rates, suggest that the current labor market respite might be a temporary illusion in the face of longer-term supply constraints. The irony, ladies and gentlemen, is that while the Fed meticulously frowns upon taking risks in its monetary policy, the government is out there rolling the dice on fiscal and trade policies that could derail the economy. When Barkin warns that inflationary headwinds are lurking on the horizon, he is effectively calling out a confluence of misguided fiscal policies, a ballooning deficit, and unpredictable geopolitical developments. It's as if our economic helmsmen have forgotten that the government's own policy decisions are a significant part of the economic equation. The Fed's hands might be tied, constrained by statutory mandates and the need to maintain its independence, but the political leadership is freely painting on a canvas of economic chaos, and we're all forced to admire the gallery of bad decisions. In the end, the narrative emerging from the corridors of economic power is one of contradiction and caution. On one hand, the Fed is cautiously optimistic about finally reining in inflation, even as it acknowledges that the battle is far from over. On the other hand, Washington continues to introduce policy elements that not only complicate this delicate balancing act but actively undermine long-term economic stability. The Fed's waiting game, let's see how the uncertainty plays out, as Barkin so wryly puts it, is less about calculated caution and more about a recognition of political impotence. In today's environment, where every policy move is a potential landmine, the central bankers remind us that stability is a myth we chase in a morass of fiscal irresponsibility and political theatrics. For the everyday American and for the professionals who analyze these policies, this isn't merely an academic debate. It's a call to demand accountability from those at the top. The government's penchant for creating policy uncertainty, ranging from unpredictable tariffs to draconian immigration measures, only serves to amplify inflationary pressures. Meanwhile, the Fed is left trying to fine-tune an instrument that's increasingly being drowned out by the cacophony of bad policy decisions. The real danger is that while the Fed prays for a modestly restrictive stance to tame inflation, the government is busy fanning the flames of fiscal imprudence. History teaches us that decisive policy reform is needed when the status quo leads to a dead end. The Fed's current stance, while commendable in its caution, is ultimately a stopgap measure, a band-aid on a festering wound. If the government continues to prioritize short-term political gains over long-term economic stability, we risk falling not into a transient slowdown, but into a protracted recession that could undermine decades of economic progress. What changes are necessary? First and foremost, Washington must recognize that a massive federal deficit is not an inexorable evil but a man-made problem that can be solved with fiscal discipline. Modern monetary theory and other fiscal experiments cannot justify ignoring the long-term ramifications of ballooning debt. Second, our approach to trade and tariffs must be rethought. While protectionism might offer the allure of salvaging domestic jobs, the historical record shows it almost invariably backfires by destabilizing markets and elevating consumer costs. And finally, an immigration policy that restricts economic opportunity does nothing but shrink the labor force and slow technological and industrial innovation. In essence, we need a coherent, forward-looking economic strategy, one that recognizes that the Fed's quest to reach that 2% inflation target is not just a technical exercise but a critical foundation for ensuring future prosperity. Until the policymakers in Washington learn to align their actions with the economic realities on the ground, the fight against inflation will be more uphill than ever. So, dear viewers and financial professionals alike, as we continue to watch this high-wire act unfold, ask yourself, who's really pulling the strings? Is it the Fed, diligently trying to stamp out inflation with every meticulously calculated step, or is it the political machine in Washington, whose inconsistent, self-serving policies are the ultimate source of our economic woes? In the coming months, as we see more data roll in and policy shifts continue to reverberate throughout the economy, one thing is clear: the battle against inflation is not just a fight against rising prices, it's a fight against the creeping influence of short-sighted, politically motivated decisions. Let's hope that the lesson of the day is not lost on our policymakers. America's economic future deserves more than cautious waiting. It requires assertive, sensible policies that prioritize long-term prosperity over ephemeral political gains. Until that day comes, the Fed's cautious, wait-and-see stance might remain our only bulwark against the reckless tide of government mismanagement. Stay tuned, stay skeptical, and as always, question everything, because in the world of economics, nothing is ever as it seems. Welcome to the real economic rodeo, where the stakes are high and the consequences of inaction are even higher.